Welcome and thanks for watching this USA Today Network in Florida special editorial board interview with Congressman Patrick Murphy, the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. I'm Matt Reed from Florida Today, and in just a minute I'll introduce you to my editorial board colleagues from across the state who have brought questions and issues to explore from their readers. But first, I'd like to thank Congressman Murphy for joining us here in the studio. Welcome to Melbourne, Representative.
Thanks for having me.
Now to our interviewers. To my immediate left is Bill Cotterill, a Capitol columnist for the Tallahassee Democrat. Alan Bartlett is editorial page editor of the Naples Daily News. Eve Samples is the opinion and engagement editor at Treasure Coast Newspapers. And Cindy McCurry-Ross is executive editor of the News Press in Fort Myers. Let's start, Congressman Murphy, by just giving you a minute to an opening statement to just explain to our viewers why you're the best choice to represent them in the U.S. Senate.
Yes, well, thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to answering your questions. And as a two-term member of Congress, I'm proud of my accomplishments for my District 18. Proud of the cuts I was able to prevent to Medicare. Proud of the legislation I was able to pass to help lower flood insurance rates for Floridians. Proud of the nearly $2 billion I was able to help authorize and the work we've been able to do to help clean up our river and protect our environment. Proud of legislation I was able to pass on the Intelligence Committee, the provisions I was able to pass to help keep this country safe. And I've been ranked as one of the most independent members of Congress because I'll work with anybody to help solve a problem, reaching across the aisle to get things done. Ultimately, if you're going to solve a problem, and coming from the private sector, the first to say that you're never going to get 100% of what you want. But if you get 80% of the deal, heck, let's take that deal and move on to the next issue. Senator Rubio is the worst voting record of any senator from Florida in nearly 50 years. And think about what's at stake this election. We can do more. We can do better. I want to be the senator from Florida. I'm going to show up to work. I'm going to roll my sleeves and get things done.
All right, Congressman, before we move on to some of the issues from our editors here, I want to ask you a clear-the-air type of question, and it has to do with your resume. During your 2012 campaign, you said that you had spent several years as a certified public accountant at Deloitte & Touche, but reports have indicated that you only had a CPA license for about 9 months while working at the firm's Miami office. Did you represent your qualifications? How can voters know that you're being straightforward with them?
Yes, well, thank you for that question, because Senator Rubio has based his entire campaign against me on a lie. You see, PolitiFact, an independent fact-checking agency, has gone through and reviewed all of these accusations. In fact, the last 6 accusations that Senator Rubio and his special interest groups have lobbied against me have been rated as false. After our debate this week, they went through it again, and they reviewed the claims. And they said that this CPA claim that Rubio is, again, building his campaign on is, quote, a technicality. You see, I am a CPA. I got my license in 2009. I'm one of 9 CPAs in the House of Representatives right now. If elected to the Senate, would be the second CPA in the history of our country to serve there. When you look at our fiscal house, I think that answers a lot of questions, unfortunately. And I have used my background as an auditor, as a CPA, to look for legislation, look for ways to help get our fiscal house in order. Fraud, waste, abuse, duplication. And that's the same thing I want to do with the U.S. Senate, but greater magnitude, because we have to get our fiscal house in order. I think that's an important background to have.
Okay, let's start asking you some questions from around the state. I'm going to turn first to my colleague Bill Cotterill from the Tallahassee Democrat.
Congressman, in the Florida Panhandle, you're probably aware we lost rail service after Hurricane Katrina 11 years ago, 12 years ago. Have you been involved at all in restoring passenger service, not only with the All Aboard Florida thing here down south, but what's a fairly important link from Jacksonville out west in our part of the state?
Yeah. Let me first start off by saying I'm a strong believer in public transportation, a strong believer in infrastructure at large. We have almost $2.5 trillion offshore right now. Some of the biggest corporations, wealthiest individuals are keeping offshore. I'm a huge proponent and have supported legislation to help bring back that money to invest in rail and roads and bridges and IT, you name it. Right? I get into climate change if you'd like, and the infrastructure I think we need for that. But I think we also need to be thinking big. Even if we aren't able to repatriate that money, Now is the time for the big picture thinking, right? The 40-year, 50-year vision where we have a new deal, right? Where we are literally paving the way for future generations. Interest rates are basically zero. Now's the time you invest. And the way I look at it, these are great middle-class jobs that can't be exported, right? These are people working with their hands. These are American jobs. So I'm a huge proponent of infrastructure. Directly to your question, though, you asked about All Aboard Florida, and that would be something I've been much more involved in than any project, of course, outside of my district. As a member of Congress, you stay in your lane, no pun intended, and look at the projects in your area. And, All Aboard Florida, I have some real concerns with. And, obviously there are folks in Orlando, folks in Miami that are more supportive of this. But when I look at it and you really dive in, I spent months and months really getting to the bottom of this. I'm quite concerned that they are going to privatize the profits and subsidize the losses on the taxpayers. And you look at, the proposed plan for, say, the ticket prices. They're saying are going to be upwards of $100 a person. So you're talking a family of four, right, going from Orlando to Miami, $400, and then they get, say, to Miami, and they got to go rent a car, right? Where do they go from there? You can rent a car, of course, for much cheaper than that in the same amount of time. They are posturing this as high-speed rail. It's technology from the 1970s, right? This train goes 80-some miles per hour, and perhaps the biggest concerns that I've been very vocal about are the safety concerns for my district. When you look at what's happening in the district, the bridges, two of the three bridges that are pretty old are in my congressional district, and you're talking wait times for the boating industry, which is of course a big part of our economy, from maybe 5-10 minutes now an hour to upwards 30-40 minutes an hour. Some real concerns there with the safety, with the crossings, with the schools and the hospitals located near this train. I support and did vocally support the president's initial plan after the stimulus for true high-speed rail that went along the turnpike corridor, interior, really high speed, 150, 200 miles per hour, something we could be proud of as Florida to say, look what we did. And imagine if we would have done that. It had been done by now. It's been 6-7 years. We'd be probably done with something we were proud of. That could have moved people from Florida, from Orlando to Miami, in maybe an hour, maybe less, with some real technology. So I have some concerns with this project from the fiscal standpoint, but also quality of life impacts on my district and much of the corridor that this is going to go along.
Alan Bartlett, Naples Daily News.
I want to pick up on the comments you made about getting our fiscal house in order, and to me that brings up the question of tax reform. We've heard your opponent's plan last year with the Lee Rubio plan. We've heard him talk about tax reform during the presidential campaign. I'm not as interested in what you think might be wrong with his plan, but I'd like to know, from your perspective in tax reform, where is your plan headed in terms of taking care of the top 1%, the poorest Floridians, and all those in the middle?
Yes. I don't think a country should be judged on how it treats its top 1%, but rather its bottom percentile. And we have a real problem with our fiscal house right now, and we are heading a very, very dangerous direction. And you have a lot of people in Washington, D.C. that talk tough on a lot of issues, but a lot of people talk tough on their fiscal house, and very little's been done. I believe there's three main components that have to be addressed, starting off with spending. Right, again, I mentioned I'm being a CPA. I want to use that experience to find that wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent spending. One of the first bills I put forward was in legislation we formed out of a group called United Solutions. It was a bipartisan group of members of Congress, was able to get about 40% of the freshman class together. When I was first elected, I'll tell you the story of how we met if you'd like, but got this group of members of Congress together, and we said, look, let's talk about the things we agree on instead of the things we disagree on, right? There's plenty of things we disagree, but let's try to build some momentum, build some relationships, get to know each other. We're human beings after all, and build some bonds. And we said our fiscal house is where we're going to focus. So long story short, introduced a bill called the SAVE Act, identified about $479 billion of wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent spending. One of the big ticket items in that, for example, was bulk purchasing. Family goes to Costco, buys in bulk, you save 10-15%. Well, I believe our government should be doing the same thing, right? Trillions of dollars of outlays. Start saving 10-15%, you're talking real money there, right? Coordinating some of the agencies and combining some of the agencies to streamline what they do, using technology to our advantage. So the spending bucket is very important. But to your point, so is the tax side, so is the revenue side. Our tax code is about as inefficient and antiquated as any country in the whole world. It's not fair for the domestic standpoint, nor is it from the international standpoint. Whether that means the S corps and the partnerships and the pass-throughs versus C corps, right? And you look at the average C corps for the Fortune 500 companies and what they're paying, it's a mere fraction, right, of what a lot of these pass-throughs are paying. And then you look at where we are on the national, the worldwide stage, right? We're not even in the ballpark, right, at 35%. I don't think we need to be the lowest in the world, don't get me wrong, but we got to be in the ballpark. And I believe that we can bring down taxes, simplify the tax rate, get rid of the loopholes, deductions, and get taxes down to 20 to 25%. There's been numerous studies showing how you do that by getting rid of some of these loopholes, but simplifying it. And again, not the lowest in the world, but in the ballpark. That, I think, makes us more competitive, helps this country stay sustainable long term. And I'll just say the third component for our fiscal house is economic growth. And in order to have that economic growth, you need certainty, you need predictability. And if you're a small business, if you're a big business, I think what the expectation should be from government is tell me my tax rates next year, tell me my tax rates in 5 years from now, what my depreciation tables are going to be, right? Tell me what the regulatory environment's going to be like, and then get the heck out of the way. And government, unfortunately, has been the complete opposite of that, especially the past 6 years or so. Government shutdowns, fiscal cliffs, sequester. I talk to a lot of business owners that are just sitting, on the sidelines, waiting for some certainty. The partisanship in our country is holding us back in so many ways, and this is certainly one of the most clear examples.
Let's go to the Treasure Coast and Eve Samples.
Congressman Murphy, thanks for being here tonight. You represent our district on the Treasure Coast, and I don't have to tell you how horrible a year it's been on our waterways. Toxic algae blooms, and despite the efforts that you've made for our estuary, both on the East Coast and the West Coast, the problem is persisting, and in some ways it's gotten a lot worse. Since the toxic algae blooms earlier this year, Senator Joe Negron, state senator, proposed buying 60,000 acres south of Lake Okeechobee to divert water from Lake Okeechobee. Do you support that proposal? And if so, how would you work in the Senate to make it happen?
Yes, well, as you know, I've been a huge proponent of doing anything we can to help send the water south. As you certainly know, I think we all know, the Army Corps of Engineers re-irrigated the Everglades, and there's been years and years of buildup and plenty of people to blame along the way, plenty of industry to blame along the way. But ultimately, if we are going to restore Mother Nature's flow south, we've got to start buying the land south of the lake and sending that water south. And while we've made some progress on C-44, on C-43, on SEP, finally, on some estuary programs, on water farming, these are all small pieces of the pie. I've always been a firm believer that you have to add up all these pieces of the pie and you will see some changes. But in a year like this, in a year like 2013, my first summer, the lost summer in Congress, we saw that these small pieces aren't nearly enough, right? With the fish kills and the die-off and the algae blooms, that we've got to do a lot more. So buying that land south is critical. I think we can negotiate and have the conversation of which tracts of land are they contiguous. How do we make sure there's enough land there? I'm not going to pretend to be a scientist, but the experts I've spoken to have made it clear that you need quite a bit of mileage, quite a bit of acreage there of land to help filter that water as it moves south. And the way it's been historically is when that water leaves the lake, by the time it gets down to Biscayne Bay, it's pristine water you can basically drink, but it takes a certain amount of time to clean that. I'm a big proponent of Amendment 1 that passed with, 75% of Floridians supporting using that money to go toward land acquisitions and purchases. And unfortunately, the governor and folks in Tallahassee have squandered that money, spent just a near fraction of it. I believe the means and the method is there for exactly what Senator Negron's done, and I hope that we can have the leadership in Tallahassee to direct that money to buying the land, sending it south. There is, I think, at least one more opportunity to execute the deal that Charlie Crist made to purchase that land.
Yes or no follow-up. So if Senator Negron is successful in Tallahassee this year, will you work to secure the federal funding, which is typically 50-50, to match it? It's a $2.4 billion or so project.
Yes, I mean, look, the federal government has to live up to their end of the deal too. And there's been times since, the SERP plan was passed, 16 years ago now, that federal government's done more and states government's gone back and forth. But both parties need to come together. And Martin County has been a real leader from the local county doing their part, putting their share of money in. But all three levels have to be working together. And the federal government certainly has to do a better job. Shouldn't be waiting years and years, 6 years, to pass a water bill with something like SEP in it that was supposed to be routine every 2 years. And I will certainly do my part advocating for that funding. But the basic premise is that the federal government, vis-a-vis Army Corps of Engineers, does a lot of the earthwork, the dirt. State does the land component, and they try to find the matching and the deal there. Anything we can do to make sure that this water is ultimately moving south is critical. And beyond just the impacts to our district and what's happening in the west coast of Florida with the Caloosahatchee and the discharges, there's a macro picture here too, and not to get too far off track, but this freshwater flow that historically used to flow south acted as a barrier to the saltwater intrusion. And in South Florida, it's limestone, it's a reef, it's a sponge. So that saltwater rising that we're seeing isn't just at the surface level, it's happening below our eyes. And there used to be a flow of fresh water south acting as a barrier. But now we're seeing our aquifers are being poisoned by the salt water coming in quicker and quicker than ever expected. So there's a lot of components that to me show how important it is that we get this water to flow south to act as that barrier to prevent these discharges. And you talk about a contrast between my opponent and I on an issue. Just the other day in our debate, still wouldn't say the word climate change, right? It says humans have nothing to do with this. Things are changing everywhere in Florida, right? The reefs are dying in the Florida Keys. High tide, Miami Beach, there's salt water on the roads. Our district, these discharges everywhere you go. Miami was the #1 city listed by National Geographic to be impacted by climate change. He lives in Miami and he denies it. That to me is the epitome of what's wrong with Washington, D.C. when you have people that put their head in the sand on an issue of this importance.
Let's go to Fort Myers and Cindy McCurry-Ross.
Yes, actually, one of our readers was very interested in what you would be doing about combating coastal issues related to climate change and the rising seawaters.
Yes, huge issue for all of Florida. And you look at the importance, I'll just start again macro, tourism industry. We had 105 million tourists last year visit Florida, largest driver of our economy. Right? While a lot of those people did go to Disney, a lot went to our beaches, right? Play golf, a lot go fishing, a lot go diving, right? Enjoy our fishing industry, so many different aspects of it. And of course, our real estate values are connected to our environment, to our coast. And it's critical that I believe we get off this reliance of fossil fuels, that we are making steps toward renewable energy, investing in wind and solar and thermal, tidal, you name it. We should be investing in so many different opportunities. And I believe at the same time, you have to be bringing in some of the biggest polluters in the world, like China and India, into the fold. And I had a chance to go to China a couple years ago on one of the committees that I sit in the Congress, and I was shocked. The advancements that they're making and the progress they're making in areas like solar and what they're doing with all sorts of renewable energy. And there's been a lot of rhetoric around renewable energy, and some people are against it for whatever reasons. I think it makes us stronger as a country. Number one, if we are the leader of solar panels, we build the best solar panels in the world. Hey, what a great opportunity to start selling that to other people, right? Great way to create some jobs. But from a private sector standpoint, if you here at this large office didn't have a power bill, right, you would be that much more efficient. I don't know, your power bill might be 15% of your expenses maybe, right? If that 15%, whatever hundreds of thousands of dollars that probably is a year, could go toward retraining, could go to new technology, computers, upgrades, right? You could be stronger as a company, right? You could be more competitive. As a nation, we will be more competitive if we don't have to rely on fossil fuels. If we are renewable and completely off that reliance, we are that much stronger. So I look at it from a national security standpoint. I look at it from a standpoint of employment, but also perhaps the most irreversible, consequential component is our coast, is our environment, something that you can't get back. The scientists have pretty much made it clear that we're almost at that tipping point where can we reverse this rise of seas at a certain pace? We can maybe slow it and mitigate, but we've set ourselves on a very dangerous course. And when the old saying, follow the money, right? And you look at the millions of dollars in politics right now from the fossil fuel industry. I think Senator Rubio's Koch brothers are spending $4.2 million a week against me right now, right? A group that's making billions and billions of dollars in the fossil fuel industry. There's no question why he's doing their bidding, why he's denying climate change, why he's rejecting the science and continuing to support things like offshore oil drilling and all the rest. That's very short-sighted for the state of Florida and the people of this country.
Thank you.
All right, I want to ask a question from the Pensacola News-Journal.
Military bases in Northwest Florida are the cornerstone of our community. They live daily with the fear that the national debt will have an impact on their presence here in our community. Are cuts to bases such as the Pensacola Naval Air Station on the table as you look at how to deal with the ever-growing national debt?
No, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Homeland Security and our military is critical. And we have to continue making sure that we have a military that isn't just the strongest today, but thinking ahead for tomorrow and thinking ahead for the challenges that we might face. And I believe that we need to be more efficient with the money we are spending on our military. And that means that we should be thinking big. And I can't tell you how many generals, right, how many folks I've spoken to come to my office and say, Patrick, there's continuing to be funding of programs that we don't even want, right? We've all heard the famous stories about the Abrams tanks, right? Thousands of tanks that the generals are saying we're never going to use. Not to oversimplify it, but I don't ever foresee another conflict where we're storming the beaches of Normandy, right? My grandfather was 101st Airborne, right? Flew in there and, I've heard those stories. Warfare is changing. The challenges we face are changing. You look at how other countries are funding their military. I believe our focus needs to be number one, of course, on the best armed, best trained military, making sure that they have everything they were promised, not only during combat, but post-combat. And that means a strong VA. Making sure that we are acquiring the assets of tomorrow. By that I mean communications, drones, surveillance, space, making sure that our special operations are the best in the world, but also making sure cyber is something that's addressed. And what did data talk about it, right? After we were just hacked, after Twitter was shut down and so many other networks were shut down. Every day we're becoming more and more connected as a nation, as individuals, militarily, et cetera, to the internet. We've got to make sure that we are addressing cyber and thinking about this from our own national security, whether that means the power grid, whether that means water, whether that means our NIH and science institutions, the universities, military, you name it. And this is an area we need to be very smart with. So the bases in Florida, I think, are critical to who we are as a state. But I believe that we need to continue looking forward to be as efficient as we can with our military spending.
Let me follow up, not so much on that issue, but with an issue that is very important here in Brevard County, and that has to do with the U.S. space program. Here in Florida, the space program includes Kennedy Space Center and NASA, programs to explore the moon or Mars potentially. It includes innovative private contractors such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, and United Launch Alliance. And it includes the U.S. Air Force Space Command and its strategic assets here on the Space Coast. So I guess the question is, on behalf of our readers, is what priorities do you support and what vision do you have for the U.S. space program?
Yes, I think our space program is something that we're proud of as a nation, certainly proud of as Floridians, and very disappointed in the defunding of what has happened with the NASA program. Thousands and thousands of qualified rocket scientists, right? That years and years of training. Thankfully, we do have some private sector companies, like you mentioned, Blue Origin and SpaceX and United and some others that are coming in, grabbing some of this talent. But I believe the federal government does play a role. And we were proud of our space program for years, right? Led the world, something to be proud of. we are losing some ground because we have cut back in these funding programs. And I believe there's a certain amount of ROI on investments that government makes, a certain amount of return on investment. For every dollar invested there will be certain returns. And there are certain things that the government can do that are very efficient, that do help spawn great industries, that make us stronger as a nation, our technologies, but also national security. Right? As mentioned, being on the Intel Committee, part of our role is to fund many of the agencies, one of those being the geospatial, and looking at what they do, looking at the resources and the assets they have, how much they've learned through the years because of the NASA program. I don't think it's smart for us to be solely reliant on some of the private companies. Nothing against them. I do think they play an important role, and I like competition. But I think the federal government does have a role in these programs, and I would like to see that funding not only for Mars, but other great ambitious programs that we're looking at.
Let's go back around the state. Tallahassee.
Speaking of ROI in Tallahassee and other university communities, there's great concern about the cost of higher education, the number of students that come out very much indebted as they start their careers, the burden on middle-class families. We heard during the primaries, I think Bernie Sanders wanted to make college free, state universities. What is not necessarily desirable, but what is doable at the congressional level in reining in the cost of higher education for the middle class?
I think the goal should be moving toward a debt-free college education. And I think that should be the goal, and we should have the conversation between the Republicans, Democrats, Independents of how we get there and what's the smartest way to get there. And I think education at large, I'll just start high level, is one of the most important things that we better get right as a nation. Right? You think of these cell phones we all have, and technology and automation, and how the world is changing. Right? They call it the Uberization of our economy. Right? And they say a lot of the jobs we have today will not be there for our kids and grandkids. The number one way to address that change is education. Right? Early education, where they say 80% of brain development happens in those first 4 to 5 years. Let's invest more money in early education. Let's make sure quality and affordable education for everybody, because it shouldn't matter, to me at least, what neighborhood you're born in. You should have quality education. And going on through, elementary, middle, high school, making sure that once you make that decision, a lot of people that I went to high school with didn't necessarily want to go to college, but there was a certain amount of pressure by their parents, by society, to go on. I think vocational schools are great, and I think we should be investing in vocational schools for folks that want to work with their hands, mechanics, engineers, whatever it might be. And I think that should be an option. But I also think that for the folks that do want to go on to get a higher education, whether that's a 2-year, 4-year master's, PhD program, shouldn't be faced with this burden of $100,000 or more in college debt. And it's setting back an entire generation that once was, maybe late 20s, early 30s, thinking about, buying that first home, right? Building a little bit of equity, improving that home, and then maybe to invest that money long term. An important step in the ladder to the middle class and growing. Maybe they had a small business idea, right, that they wanted to invest X amount of money in. But when you have this burden of $50,000, $100,000 of college debt, you're holding back an entire generation. And, what was the equivalent perhaps of maybe my parents' generation of a college or at least 2-year degree? For my generation, certainly is a 4-year college degree. For my kids, it's going to be a master's or maybe even PhD. We have to keep moving the bar. And again, it's not just looking at it from an insular U.S. perspective. It's a global economy. So much of what we do every day is connected. We have to look at what our competitors are doing, and we have to keep moving that bar. So I believe in order to do that, we have to address the cost of education, skyrocketing over the past 10 to 15 years, the sheer cost of it. Looking at ways that we can make college more efficient, making sure that those Pell Grants, that those opportunities are there for more students to go on to higher education, that it's not this burden. A lot of that's going to mean making sure that some of the largest corporations, the wealthiest few in this country, are paying their fair share. And you said it, ROI. Talk about good ROI. Investing in education is perhaps the best ROI we can have as a country. So I'm all for moving that bar, having that negotiation of how you're going to pay for and what we're going to do. But a big component is bringing down the cost, making sure people can move on to that higher education if they choose.
Naples.
Earlier, you talked about the beaches being important as an economic destination here for tourists, and you spoke about sea level rise. My question comes back to beach erosion. Outside of the major hurricane events that we see that cause erosion, whose financial responsibility do you consider it to make sure our beaches are replenished? Is it a local government? Is it state government? Or is it the federal government?
Yeah, great question, and was faced with this my first couple terms in the Congress. We have miles and miles of shore along the Atlantic, and what we've seen is a typical schedule. That the Army Corps has had historically, maybe 7 years, maybe 10 years, that they would have on a cycle to come back and replenish our beaches, is now 3 years or 4 years. Next thing you know, they don't have enough assets to go around to replenish the sand on our beaches, nor do they have the personnel or the money to fund all of this. So there is a larger burden on the federal government, state and local. And I think everybody has a piece, in that pie. We've seen some of the local governments take the initiative and say, hey, federal government, we know you're busy. We know you don't have the money. We know we're off the schedule. We got to wait X amount of years till you're coming back. We're going to fund this right now. Give us the approvals. We need this sand. There's been sand wars, maybe just short of that Eve knows about in our district with some of the sand off Fort Pierce that other counties to the south of us are trying to get. So there are some, not to get too much in the details and the weeds, but there are some, I think, antiquated laws about that sand, where it's coming from, what it's used for. But there's a component of this that I think is important to address, that we shouldn't just be looking at the, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing, expecting different results, right? Just keep pumping the sand, keep pumping this. Right, there's things we can look at, bigger picture here, whether that's barriers off the shore, X amount of feet, hundreds of yards offshore to help break that initial wave surge that comes in to prevent some of that erosion. Some of the pumps we've seen, the pump stations near Palm Beach, they have one of these pump stations. As that flow of sand moves south, helping to replenish it along in between the jetties, in between the inlets. Helping that recycle, so it doesn't just build up on the south end, and then the north end of the island would be be naked with no sand. So helping these pump stations, that natural flow of sand, recycle, to me might be a little bit more investment on year one, but over a 10-year, 50-year period, we're going to save the taxpayers a lot of money. So we've looked at several different plans on Singer Island. Been talking to quite a few of the different environmental groups that are there. That were concerned with some of the migration of the turtles and others with some of these seawalls. But I think there's more that we can do. The science is now there that we think a little bit smarter about this instead of just replenishing. While we need to do it in the near term, let's look long term.
Treasure Coast.
I'd like to return to the issue of Lake Okeechobee and the discharges because it's been such a dire year on that front. But this time I want to talk about political influence and players. We did ask Senator Rubio earlier today about the large amount of contributions he's received to his campaigns and committees from the sugar industry. We've not seen that level of contribution to your campaigns. So the question is, what is your relationship with leaders in that industry, and how can we know you'll be an effective statesman to bring those players to the table, because they do need to be there?
Yeah, hey, I said it earlier, follow the money. Look, I've never taken money from the sugar industry, but as I've said from the beginning, I don't vilify them. I think there's many players at the table here, and I would much rather have sugar. I'd much rather have all of agriculture, to be honest, at the table with the Army Corps of Engineers, with the local and state government, to figure out a plan for how we solve this problem, because it's only getting worse. And you look at Senator Rubio giving basically the exact same talking points that the sugar industry is giving. That's not the solution. Everyone's got to be at the table here. I'm going to continue to do what I think is best for the state of Florida, regardless of any thing else. I made that pledge to my district before, and I think that's why I have one of the most independent voting records in the Congress. Is, I don't put on blinders and go vote or just listen to one group or listen. I try to analyze every issue, and because of that, taken plenty of votes that some people in my party aren't happy with. But this is a great example of always standing up to do what I think is best for the environment, for the district, for the people of Florida. I'm going to continue doing that.
Let's switch gears here now to immigration. And this is a question from one of our audience members, Gloria Graff of North Fort Myers, Florida. And she says that both of the presidential candidates seem to agree that there is a need for some level of immigration reform. Her question is, should Cuban immigrants be treated the same as Mexican, Haitian, Syrian, or immigrants from around the world? Now that U.S. relations with Cuba are beginning to improve, should there be an end to wet foot, dry foot policy that's applied to Cubans?
Yes, well, first, I am a firm believer in comprehensive immigration reform, making sure that we are looking at this holistically, making sure that we have a plan, number one, that does secure our borders. Not only the borders themselves, but tracking those that are coming into this country on a visa, because that is a big piece of the issue. Making sure that there is a pathway to citizenship, right? Those 11 to 12 million undocumented people are in this country. Make sure that there's a pathway. Paying their back taxes, getting the back of the line, an orderly process. We can talk about the time frame for that, but I think that's the path. Doing what we can to keep families together, the kids that are going to some of our great universities, colleges, that they're not getting kicked out the day they graduate, right? That's all important component of this. But I think you're right. We should be looking at this, holistically and making sure that as we are, adapting and moving forward with a more normalized view toward Cuba, which I do support, that the immigration component follows in line there. And this is an area, again, that Senator Rubio and I don't see eye to eye on. I don't knock him on this. I understand it's a very personal issue. I have family members that are Cuban. Talk Cuban politics with my aunts and cousins and understand that issue. But I believe for not only national security, which is an important component of this, right? Would we rather see Royal Caribbean and Carnival in Havana, or would we rather see the Russian military there? Of course, we'd rather see American vessels there. And I say that because Russian spy ships are frequently there. But also because we should be helping the Cuban people. And I believe that the embargo has only empowered the Castro regime, has only given them an excuse for why things aren't working. Let's give them what they fear the most, right? And that's capitalism. That is the way we will change things in Cuba. And nobody does democracy like us. Once our values, once our free press and free religion and values are more inserted there and available, there will be no stopping it. I think that'll change things for the better in Cuba. We've had a policy for 58 years now that hasn't worked. I think we can do better, and in doing so and normalizing, I think that will beg the question of the immigration component there and how we look at that, which will follow that movement.
So just to follow up, so yes or no on reconsidering wet foot, dry foot?
I think that's got to follow the moves toward normalization. I think they work in unison.
Great, thank you.
Here's a question from the Pensacola News Journal. We've touched on this subject a little bit before.
Northwest Florida coastlines were among those most directly ravaged by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Senator Bill Nelson has opposed recent moves to expand drilling and energy exploration from neighboring Gulf Coast states such as Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. As a senator, will you flatly oppose any expansion of oil-related drilling and energy exploration in the Gulf Coast?
I don't support it. I never have supported more offshore oil drilling off the coast of Florida. I've seen firsthand the damage that it can do. After that, BP oil spill, there was a lot of talk of that oil getting in the loop current of the Gulf of Mexico, coming down Florida's west coast through the Keys, up the Gulf Stream. And I was able actually to put some oil skimmers together to go to work. Number one, trying to prevent that oil from getting to the Florida Keys, where I'm from, but getting to work in the Gulf, seeing the damage firsthand that oil can do to our beaches, to our shores, to our economy, right? For years, we're still, dealing with the effects of the industry. I would much rather be investing in renewable energy, the wind, the solar, the tidal, right? The Gulf Stream runs right off our shore at 4 or 5 knots, right? 24/7. Why aren't we tapping into that? Great source of free energy. We got to be thinking big in our country, right? Thinking new, not these old, antiquated, ways that are only holding us back as a nation and costing us in so many other ways. And something that I don't think really thought through entirely by people like Senator Rubio that do support more offshore oil drilling isn't just the rig that's offshore, however many miles it might be. It's what's happening on the coast, right? We have beaches, we have tourism, we have hotels, and we have all sorts of businesses there along. when you start and you go to the Gulf Coast and you see this, next thing you know, you have refineries, right? You've got the helicopters flying back and forth. You've got the trucks. You've got the equipment. You've got all this nasty, equipment that starts taking over the coastline. That's not who we are as Florida. And I don't know why anybody would want to go in that direction, considering the beauty that we have and how many people come to Florida for that beauty. Why would we want to go backwards? So I don't support that, especially since we all know there's alternatives out there. Right? You talk to the folks at NextEra, right? And they'll tell you, what's going on with solar. That is actually a great opportunity for them. They are continuing to move toward renewable energy, making money doing it. Right? We're there. Right? The technology has come a long way in the last 5 to 10 years. Let's keep going in that direction.
I have a question from right here in Central Florida. Of course, the issue extends much farther. Following the shooting massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, we heard some renewed calls for gun safety measures. Ideas have included universal background checks or blocking people who are on the do not fly list from buying firearms. The Senate, however, has rejected both of those things. What would be your position on gun measures like that if you were elected senator?
Yeah, it's sickening to me that more hasn't been done. I'll tell you just a quick story. When I was first elected to the Congress, they have these trainings basically for members of Congress, these orientations where the Republicans, Democrats, they get together and talk about legislation and what to do. And in one of those initial orientations, a member of Congress named Elizabeth Esty stood up in tears in the middle of the class and ran out. What happened? What just happened? Turned out she was the member of Congress that represented Sandy Hook, where dozens of children were shot and killed. And I remember that moment so distinctly because we all stood there in chills, looking at our phones, turning on the news, seeing what was happening, saying we are going to do something at a minimum to make sure these tragedies don't happen. Just something basic, right? Investing more in mental health, making sure there's background checks for people that want to buy weapons, keeping these dangerous weapons out of the hands of the mentally unstable. Right? Domestic abusers, doing something to close the loopholes, whether that's the terrorist gun loophole, whether that's the gun show loophole. There are some common sense measures that I think we can take that do not hinder the Second Amendment at all. Right? I support the Second Amendment. I support law-abiding gun owners. I hunt, I fish, I enjoy our outdoors. It doesn't mean we can't do things that keep weapons out of the hands of terrorists. And we haven't had any votes on this in the Congress, in the House, and that's shameful. And then, Marco Rubio has the audacity to use the shooting at Pulse as his reason for getting back into the Senate race when he's been one of the leading anti-gay senators in the whole country and done nothing to support any reasonable, legislation, bipartisan legislation to close the terrorist gun loophole, right? Somehow he thinks it's okay for a suspected terrorist to be able to go buy a AR-15 or an AK-47. That just doesn't add up. And again, I hate to say it, but follow the money. He just got $1 million or so from the NRA attacking me, right? Follow the money. He's continuing to be supported by the special interest groups. He's going to the Senate, doing their bidding. We can do more to protect this country, to protect people. Common sense measures, right? We're not talking about crazy steps here, right? These are common sense things supported by the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of gun owners. And I think we can do more as a country. And if Senator Rubio can't stand up to the gun lobby and going to allow terrorists to buy weapons, I mean, think about what our intelligence officials do every day, right? These brave people that we may or may not ever know what they do, right? And they're out there trying to protect this country. And they're putting people on the suspected no-fly list, can't get on an airplane. And then they come to find out that they can go buy a weapon, right? It just doesn't make sense at all. These are loopholes. We got to close them. I'm going to stand up and do that.
Tallahassee.
The last question I asked Senator Rubio earlier today was about Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably more important to Florida than any other state.
You bet.
Specifically, well, what do you think needs to be done? And specifically, do we need to raise or even abolish the cap on taxable earnings, which I think is something like $117,000?
$118,500. Right now, that is the cap, $118,500. I believe that Social Security and Medicare, for that matter, are two of the most important achievements, I would say, in our country's history, and have helped lift and keep more people out of poverty than probably anything else. And I talk to seniors in my district all the time and all over the state of Florida that are, making decisions day to day between, the food Are they going to eat, or are they going to pay for their prescription drugs? Seniors cutting their drugs in half because they can't quite afford it, and making some terrible decisions with the food and those choices that they're making. These are the seniors, the folks that built this country, right? These are not entitlements. These are programs they've been paying into their entire life. There is an easy fix in raising the cap, and it is a scale there. How quickly do you raise the cap, in the timing of that? But there's legislation I've supported to raise that cap, get it to $150,000, depending again how quickly you do that. But the quicker you do that, the more sustainable this program is. And there's numerous pieces of legislation out there that ensure decades of life, if not infinity, to Social Security just by raising the cap. So I think that is a common sense reform that we should all be able to rally around.
Naples.
We've heard you talk here in the last half hour or so about restoring the 50-50 split and the federal government living up to that, buying land south of the lake, debt-free education, some other programs. How do you approach all of that when we've got a $20 trillion debt?
Yeah. I talked about it a little bit before, and it's all components. You have to look at the spending, you have to look at the tax, the revenue component, and economic growth. And they all do work together. We have a tremendous amount of wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent government spending in this country. You look at just the sheer amount of regulatory agencies we have. I think we get in this argument of more regulation, less regulation, and stereotyping. It's not about that. It's smarter regulations. And we can make so many of our regulatory bodies so much more efficient and use taxpayer money smarter, more wise. And we're not doing that. I mentioned the SAVE Act earlier, right? That was within a couple months. Some freshman members of Congress found $479 billion of wasteful, duplicative spending, right? There's a lot more out there that we got to go after. You can use that money to fund these programs in education. We can make sure that by raising the cap, we are ensuring the longevity of Social Security. We don't have to have that conversation, raise the cap, right? By making sure that we address the revenue component, the tax component, that is fair, right? Just making sure people are paying their fair share, right? The fact that, I don't want to invoke his name, but Donald Trump, bragging about not paying anything in taxes, and how many people now are taking advantage of so many of these loopholes. People got to pay their fair share. There was a time in our country's history where people, I think, were proud to pay their fair share, where they knew that X amount was going to go toward the future of their families, their kids, whether that's roads, whether that's education, whether that's space travel, right? These are good investments we're making. People have lost confidence in government, and we have to help instill that. I think some of that will certainly come back when we have some real leaders that are willing to compromise, that are willing to make a deal, shake hands. It might be ugly along the way, but you gotta ultimately shake hands and move the ball forward and make that understanding that I said earlier. You're not gonna get 100% of what you want. You guys don't, every girl, at work, I don't, every day. Get 80%, let's make the deal, and let's move on to the next issue.
Quick follow-up. Are there any of those federal regulatory agencies that you alluded to there that you would do away with?
I don't think it's doing away with them. I think we can consolidate a lot of them. You look at the agencies and how so many of them have evolved over the past 50 to 100 years. Different world. Things have changed so much. So much of what small businesses have to deal with regulatory wise, filling out paperwork that doesn't make any sense anymore. I always get into this conversation with my peers in the Financial Services Committee when you look at something like Dodd-Frank. Sarbanes-Oxley. As an auditor at Deloitte, this is what I dealt with a lot with Sarbanes-Oxley. After WorldCom, after Enron, we had to do something to address those failures. But the intent versus the implementation are usually much different. And I believe, again, Dodd-Frank, another great example, we had to do something after the Great Recession. But what JP Morgan, what Chase does, what Bank of America does versus what Seacoast, what a local regional community bank is doing, two totally different deals. We need to be smarter about how we are regulating. And I think, if cooler heads prevailed, for lack of a better word, we could see some of that progress. One of the real disappointments I had on the Financial Services Committee was some legislation we were looking at to help these small banks, these these community and regional banks to ease some of the regulatory requirements on them, and was almost promised by leadership that we were going to have a vote to do some of this. Nothing has come up because of this partisan nonsense and finger pointing, and it just gets lost. I mean, some of the stories I could tell you, in the Congress of how people won't even shake my hand, because I'm a Democrat, and the Republican-Democrat fights. You think about the problems we face as a nation, we got to rise above that.
Treasure Coast.
I'm going to challenge you to be concise on this answer.
Oh.
In one sentence, please identify what you see as the greatest opportunity for economic growth in Florida, and then point to one example of policy action you've taken to leverage it.
Yes. I think we have great opportunities with taking advantage of what we already have, and that's tourism and real estate, together. I think that is something we already have. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have it right there. How do you do that? How do you continue to grow? Number one, addressing climate change, accepting it's real, moving toward renewable energy so we protect those opportunities for the future. Making sure that real estate industry is vibrant. It is connected to, of course, our environment, but ensuring that we have, an economy that has some certainty, has some predictability.
Example of policy action?
Yeah, you do that by being bipartisan. Some of the legislation I've supported on the Financial Services, Committee, I think helps find that compromise, helps find that balance where that small business, that entrepreneur, that 30-year-old with a great idea, has an opportunity through, the Small Business Committee, through a grant that I've supported, through legislation to help ease regulations on the community banks and the regional banks so they can give that loan, right, to that individual to grow.
I asked your opponent earlier about his level of support for his party's candidate for President of the United States, Donald Trump. As you're well aware, your party's candidate is not the most beloved in history as a candidate for United States President, Hillary Clinton. Can you talk about your level of support for Hillary?
Yes. I'll just say, first off, it is sad to me that whomever our next president is, how they're going to enter office, right? And the amount of distrust and hatred and finger pointing and how nasty it's become. Saddens me for the future of our country that, our kids and grandkids, what they're growing up seeing right now. Our country's better than this, right? Nobody's perfect, but my gosh, the people that are putting their life out there for public service, you don't have to agree with all their plans, but it is sad. Specifically to Secretary Clinton, look, she's apologized, she's taken responsibility and said she regrets it and wouldn't have done it, in hindsight had she had the opportunity. So, I was very careful to listen to all her words, to comment. My votes, I think, speak accordingly to questions and what I thought, and believe that, her at her word, that she is sorry for this. But look, at the end of the day, she's going to hit the ground running, right? She knows what's going to happen on day one. I trust her with the nuclear codes, right? That's more than Marco Rubio even said about Donald Trump, right? Marco Rubio said Donald Trump was a con man, said it was horrifying what his positions are, said he doesn't trust him with the nuclear codes. Senator Rubio's on the Intelligence Committee, right? A lot of the stuff I can't even get into now that Senator Rubio should know better, that he's still supporting Donald Trump, to me just shows the political desperation that he's putting his own political career in front of what's best for Florida, right? There's times and there's elections where you gotta, I think, dig deep inside and show who you are as a person and show that integrity and be willing to put your party aside and stand up for what you believe in, right? For what our kids and grandkids are going to be looking at this election, right? That arc of history, as they say, is long, but each step along the way does matter. Elections matter. What our leaders say, whomever our next president is, and these two candidates, their words really do matter. We should be expecting more, and anybody with that courage and conviction should stand up, and Senator Rubio hasn't done that.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our program. I hope you learned a lot about Congressman Patrick Murphy, who is the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. Get that straight on behalf of Florida Today. I want to thank my USA Today network colleagues for joining us here. And I want to thank Congressman Murphy for joining us in the studio. From our studio on the Space Coast, thanks for watching.